All welcome to today's webinar. My name is Khadijat Amolabi. I'm the head of Department of Agricultural Economics Department, University of Ilorin. And I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Vice Chancellor of the University of Ilorin, Professor Wahab Olashupo Egbewole, SAN, and the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture, Professor Israel Ogunlade. I'd also like to recognize our distinguished speakers, other senior members of the Faculty of Agriculture, including Professor Lubumi Abayomi Motesho, colleagues from the department, participants, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to today's webinar, which is the second in the series of webinars hosted by the Department of Agricultural Economics and Farm Management. The theme for today's webinar is strengthening research quality and impact, publishing, funding, and communicating evidence. The topic was carefully chosen to address some key gaps that limit the capacity of faculty and students to effectively communicate their research ideas, whether in the form of research articles or policy documents. Another important area we are focusing on is how we can write better to improve our chances of accessing opportunities such as grants and fellowships, especially given how competitive these opportunities have become. We have carefully selected the speakers for today's webinar, and I will tell you more about them shortly. But before then, let me quickly go through the ground rules for the webinar. So please kindly keep your microphones muted during the presentation to avoid background noise. Also, kindly use the chat box to post questions. We'll take some of your questions during the Q&A session and be respectful and professional. Also, keep your questions brief and relevant. And please note that the session is being recorded. So regarding the flow of event, we will start with the opening remarks, after which we'll hear from our speakers, starting with Mark, followed by Jenna and Maya. This will then be followed by a Q&A session. Though if you have some burning questions to ask the speakers, you can ask those speakers directly in between the sessions. After the Q&A session, we'll take the general picture, then we'll hand it over to the Dean to give his closing remarks. We hope to wrap up this webinar by 4:20 p.m. So let's begin. So it's indeed an honor and a privilege for me to invite the Vice Chancellor of the University of Ilorin, Professor Wahab Olashupo Egbewole, SAN, to deliver his opening remarks. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, HOD. Other distinguished participants, I can see that Mark is already here. I can also see that Jenna is there as well as Maya. I want to appreciate the department for taking up this challenge by calling attention to one of the key issues that seems to be affecting our universities and as academics. The topic that the department has decided to focus on this afternoon, at least as far as Nigeria is concerned, strengthening research quality and impact, publishing, funding, and communicating evidence, is not only apt, it is definitely timely, given the fact that as universities, the essence of our existence is to do research. But the kind of research that we're doing must be impactful. If the researches must be impactful, it can only be beneficial to the society to be able to underscore its impact. And of course, if we now say it is relevant, it is impactful, then such a research must have quality. That is one of the areas that I believe our speakers will be touching on today. And I believe that we should also look at the need for funding impactful researches, which is a challenge for the global South. It appears the global North has navigated that bend. But of course, we cannot overemphasize the fact that researches would continuously have to be supported with funding. But if we have impactful research, we have quality research, but this is not appropriately communicated, then the essence of the research is defeated. And I believe that why the department is looking at all of this together is for, in my view, for the speakers to provide the roadmap that will assist our existence as researchers. I'm pleased to be here, and it's my hope that by the closure of this discourse, we'll have been able to identify in clear terms how we can appropriately make our researches more impactful, how we can fund our researches, and of course, the outcomes of this webinar will also be available for the university to share with other departments for the purpose of comparing best practices. Once again, thank you so very much for having me.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir, for such an inspiring opening. And it's in that spirit that I invite our first speaker. Our first speaker is Professor Mark Belmar. Mark is a McKnight Presidential Chair in Applied Economics, a distinguished McKnight University professor, a distinguished university teaching professor, and Northrop professor at the University of Minnesota. I'm sure we'll all agree that it is a real honor to have Mark speak with us today, as there's definitely no better person to talk about writing applied and agricultural economics research. He's the author of the book, Doing Economics, What You Should Have Learned in Grad School But Didn't. I have a copy of the book myself, which I think everyone here should read. His personal website is also rich, and I personally visit it often for the writing tips and sometimes to borrow ideas and steal some of his codes because he dumps his replication files on his website. And he also sends out newsletter regularly, and I strongly suggest we all subscribe so we can continue to benefit from his wealth of experience. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Khadija. And thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chancellor. It's really nice to have this opportunity to talk about things that I have spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about, obviously. And so it's very nice to be here. And again, thank you for the invitation. So Khadija, you sent me a very kind of ambitious program. You wanted me to talk about research, so strengthening research quality and impact, but also publishing, funding, and communicating evidence. So I've tried to synthesize what I have written in the book on those topics in a 30-minute talk. And let's see if I succeed in squeezing that in such a short time. So here's an overview. I'm just going to be talking about these various topics, and I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on each, but I'm most curious to hear the questions that you will have at the end. One of the things that kind of sparked me or drove me to write the book is that there's a hidden curriculum in economics. There's a hidden curriculum, I think, in most of academia, but economics seems it's the discipline that I operate in, and so of course you tend to see all the flaws in where you operate in. And what I've noticed is that most PhD programs train students at technical levels that are pretty much comparable from one institution to the other. We all have access to the same textbooks. We all have kind of access to the same banks of problem sets and old tests, and we can develop those technical skills in micro theory or macro theory or econometrics at kind of the same levels. But what distinguishes kind of good from bad PhD programs is what I've noticed kind of traveling, giving talks here and there over the last 20 years is this hidden curriculum being taught. It's kind of this interstitial knowledge that is rarely taught explicitly, that you kind of pick up from talking to your advisors, and even when you do pick that up from advisors, it's often kind of unintentional, or you really have to explicitly seek it out, right? You have to go talk to your advisor and say, hey, how does the peer review process operate? Because I distinctly remember when I started my PhD in 2001, I had no idea that you submitted articles to journals, then they went to reviewers, then it came back with anonymous reviews, and you could only submit to one journal. You couldn't submit to another journal, and so on. And you couldn't submit the same paper to the same journal if it had been rejected, and so on. And the analogy that kind of came to mind as I was thinking about that and as I was starting with the book is something that I read in an interview with William Gibson, science fiction author who's probably best known for coining the term cyberspace back in the day, back in the 1980s. And in an interview, he said something like, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I think he was talking about about the technology that's available to people. And he was thinking, I think, primarily of Japan at the time, which was very, very technologically advanced, but not, the US wasn't quite at that level. And I feel like the same is true of kind of craft knowledge, not technical knowledge, but craft knowledge in academic research. And so what we'll cover is publishing, funding, and communicating evidence. And my core thesis here, and I'll make those slides available to you all if you want to see them at the end, is that excellence in one area can't really substitute for the others. Research impact really requires being competent or good at all three of those things. You can't really publish without funding. I certainly have done quite a bit of work without funding. I tend to operate on a shoestring, but generally speaking, you have to have funding to publish. And then, if you want to communicate evidence, well, you have to have written something. You can't just kind of like go and talk about stuff that's not written because people won't know about it. And probably kind of the thing that I'm most equipped to talk about is writing papers that get read by people. So if I compare with without any kind of pretense of false modesty, if I compare with people in my cohort in agricultural economics, I have a lot more citations than a lot of those people. And it's not because I'm smarter, it's not because I just I'm technically better. But I certainly have developed over the years kind of an ability to kind of identify interesting questions that I think will be of interest to people outside of my own narrow niche in agricultural economics. And I've spent a great deal of time kind of developing the craft of writing. And a lot of that was kind of incidental because when I was an undergraduate, I had no intention of becoming an economist at the time. I started out studying philosophy and I wanted to be a reporter. And so I spent some time working as a reporter for a regional newspaper close to where my parents lived. And then I got involved with the university's newspaper, of which I became editor in my senior year, I think. And so I spent a lot of time kind of like what makes kind of clear communication, and all of that was in French. So if you say, well, he's got it easy, he speaks English very well. English is not my first language. So if English is your second language, know that this is something that you can develop as well. English became kind of the lingua franca of academics, especially in economics, because English is relatively easy compared to a bunch of other languages, certainly compared to French, for instance, or Mandarin, which my daughter is learning in school. English only has a limited number of verb tenses, doesn't have genders for things, and so it makes it pretty easily grasped. One of the problems with writing papers is that if you say, well, I want to become a development economist or a labor economist or a health economist, you are in all likelihood going to be taking, one, two, maybe three or four field courses in development economics, labor economics, health economics. And in those courses, what you're going to be presented with is kind of a reading list of the best papers written in that field. You're going to see kind of like these really nicely done, kind of the best papers ever written on various topics. And they're very polished. They're near perfect because, they've gone through the peer review. They're in very, very good journals. And it makes it really hard. So if you want to study what makes someone poor, you can't just sample poor people because you don't have any good basis for comparison. So if you want to know what makes a paper good versus what makes a paper bad, you have to read some bad papers every once in a while. And graduate students tend to have very little time, and their instructors do not kind of explicitly have them read bad papers. You have to seek that out. And it helps to know the way people will read an article is not the way it is written. So people get into inspectional reading. When I was editor, for instance, at the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, I got to be very, very quick at reading an article, and I wouldn't read it word for word, cover to cover. I'd look at the title, abstract, introduction. If it piqued my interest, I would go further. If I didn't think it was going to work out for the journal, I'd just kind of desk reject it. Then you skip to the methods, right? You don't kind of read the whole background section, and then you look at the results if you're kind of on board with everything up until that point. So the way we read those papers is very efficient, and that's kind of the way we teach students to read papers as well. Don't read the whole thing if you don't have to, but it's a very, very poor model for how we write papers. And so the structure in which we present work really differs fundamentally from the order in which we do things, in which we do the work. And so here's on the left-hand side, the standard structure for an applied paper, but the critical principles are you have to kind of know what the rules are. You have to know how to write an introduction. You have to know what works for a title and an abstract. You have to know in what order things are presented. How do you present theoretical work if you have a theoretical model? And this is especially true for researchers who are more junior, so graduate students, assistant professors, people who are not quite at the senior level. You really have to know the rules really, really well in order to be able to break them. So the analogy that I have in the books, I'm a jazz musician in my spare time, and the analogy that I have in the book is, if you've ever heard the music of John Coltrane, some of it might have sounded very, very foreign to you, especially if you caught kind of the later waves of what he was doing. It almost sounds like noise to some people. There's a certain logic to it, but before he got to that point on albums like A Love Supreme, he really kind of spent years and years of playing kind of more traditional standard stuff that followed the rules of what jazz was at the time. And so one of the things that's the most important here is your introduction. And I think in the book I mentioned, for every paper that I've published, I probably have rewritten the introduction 50 to 100 to maybe 200 times, because this is kind of like, if you go window shopping, if you go in a busy shopping district, your introduction is basically your store window. People look at that and then they decide whether they want to look at the whole thing. The two greatest sins you can commit in a paper are the sins of omission and the sins of hiding information. So don't leave anything out of your intro that's really important. Don't hide anything. And then, like, from a practical perspective, the way you should write is you should use present tense for data and results and for just about everything, and past tense for prior literature. Um, those are not hard and fast rules, but I see a lot of papers written in the past tense. And I realize that with the rise of generative AI, it'll be very, very tempting to kind of get ChatGPT or Claude or whichever one you like to kind of write your paper for you. Um, if those models are trained on what's available out there, you're going to get something that's not great, and it's going to generate more slop than it generates interesting writing. So, maybe it's fine for a first draft, but I would say, in fact, I wouldn't use it for a first draft, but I would say just do your own writing, because that's going to be a lot more interesting than anything generative AI can. Generative AI is perfectly fine to fix your writing if you have poor grammar or spelling. Like I said, many readers engage only with the intro, with the methods and a few tables. The intro has to stand alone. You have to state the question, the gap, the strategy, the finding. I give out in chapter 2 a number of formula that you can use to write your introduction. They all work pretty well. There's one by Dave Evans that's specific to development economics. And one of the things, what I said, the way we read is very efficient, the way we write is very inefficient, and that's not about to change, is that in the introduction, you have to tell your reader almost everything about your paper that they want to know. And then you spend the middle of the paper telling them everything about the paper. And then in the conclusion, you pretty much have to summarize what you've done in the paper and what it means for kind of the bigger picture. So in English, there's this, how do you write effectively? You first have to tell them what you're going to tell them. You tell them what you want to tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them. And so a common mistake or a common failure is to leave out crucial information. As a reader, I don't want to have to kind of skip around your paper looking for something. If you say, oh, I use, I calculate a dependency ratio. A lot of people know what a dependency ratio is. They're not all calculated the same. And I would like to have a precise formula. So if you say I use the dependency ratio as a control variable, you better have a table somewhere where you define that, and you better tell me now, or you have a footnote telling me how you calculate that, or where you force the reader to hunt for stuff. And so the opportunity cost of your reader's time is very high. Assume that your readers are very busy. And one of the most kind of jarring and yet useful things that we tell students, and that I was told when I was a graduate student, was no one cares about your paper, which is not entirely true. You certainly care about your paper. Your friends and colleagues and your advisors care about your paper. But anyone other than that has plenty of time, plenty of things that they need to get to. They have plenty of papers that they want to read. No one has copious amounts of free time in this job. And so, no one has time to read unless you make them care about reading it. And so that's where the writing really matters. So state the most important facts from every section in the introduction, and never assume that a reader will have kind of the time and generosity to kind of go further in your paper looking for information that you're not giving them. When it comes to generating empirical results, and this is I've been teaching this these days because in the latter half of the spring semester I teach a PhD course on causal inference. But the credibility revolution that took place roughly between the mid 90s when Imbeds and Angris kind of published their paper on late, and Angris was doing work on returns to education and labor markets to about 2010, really raised the standards of evidence. Now, it really, really helps, and it's almost necessary at some journals to have evidence that is, causal beyond any reasonable doubt. And so every applied paper must address, sources of endogeneity like reverse causality or an observed heterogeneity and measurement error. And I would say, and we have this in the first problem set that we're assigning this week in my class, violations of the stable unit treatment value assumption. It's no longer necessary to say, oh, well, I've got, everything is good, it should be identified. You also need to think about, are there spillovers that are kind of contemporaneous or over time? And there are ways to kind of think about that. You can't always fix that problem. In many cases, you can't, but it certainly helps to kind of think through those things or think through sattva violations for and with your reader. Robustness checks are no longer an option. They're now required. So that's another thing that most readers don't realize, is that they read a 20-page paper in a journal and they don't really realize that the manuscript that was submitted to the journal was probably 100 pages. So I've got a paper that's forthcoming in the Journal of Human Resources. The paper that we submitted for a first round was 105 pages because we had estimated every possible specification we could think of. We'd done all the robustness checks we could think of. And then it's only when the paper started kind of getting revised and resubmit decisions and accept that the editor said, please, for the love of God, can you please cut down on the number of results that you're showing me, because this is way too much. Take these 5 tables, show me that. I believe you on the rest. So you have to have lots of robustness checks. And then same with an analysis of mechanisms. Nowadays, it's no longer sufficient to say, oh, I find an effect. Well, tell me why there is an effect after telling me that you find it and telling me that it is robust, right? That it's not a one-off. And so I encourage, students and younger researchers to be strategically honest. As an editor, as a reviewer, I would much rather you tell me, here are the limits of what I'm doing, than try to kind of hedge and lie about it and kind of omit things and hope that I don't notice things. Manuscripts that overclaim, manuscripts that, that try to hide certain things are much more likely to be rejected. So just, admit to the limitations of your work. And not every paper can make an externally valid statement that is causal and completely identified. The minimum for robustness checks, things that you should be doing: look at multiple outcomes if you can, look at multiple treatments if you can. So like, you can typically take an outcome and find more than one version of it. You can typically find a treatment and find more than one version of it, unless you are randomizing treatment yourself. You can do placebo tests, you can do falsification tests, and then alternative estimators. Difference between placebo tests and falsification tests is that in one case, you inflict a fake treatment if you can. And in another case, you look at kind of a fake outcome or an outcome that should not be changing in response to your actual treatment. When it comes to navigating peer review, I hear all kinds of things all the time about peer review. It's a frustrating process, certainly. No one is enamored with it. No one thinks it's no one thinks it's fun. It's very imperfect. It can be very slow. It can be idiosyncratic. So in other words, you draw comments from a reviewer who, you would never get from anybody else because, 30 years ago they worked on that topic and now they hate it and they just want to vent their frustrations. And it is sometimes unfair. In fact, maybe most of the time it is unfair. But like Churchill said about democracy, it's not a great system. It nevertheless is the best of a number of really bad systems. And so one of the things that I used to think when I was more junior, and that I still see a lot of junior researchers say, is we should do away with anonymous peer review. And I can see why that is a seductive thing, right? Because when people hide behind the veil of anonymity, they are much more likely to make kind of snide remarks or kind of demeaning comments. And that's really suboptimal because it doesn't really help. It's not constructive. At the same time, the fact that we have anonymous peer review ensures that we get unbiased remarks as much as possible. Because when I remember talking, I was at a conference, I forget what year that was, but probably 2012 in Brazil. And I had, lucky enough to be sitting next to an editor of a journal in my field, and we're having, nice dinner and a couple of glasses of wine. And I said, hey, I think peer review should not be anonymous. And then he said, okay, let's entertain that thought. Would you be willing to write a negative review on an article, non-anonymous, right, with your name on it, on an article from someone who's very senior in your field and who from whom you might require a tenure letter at some point, right? Has kind of like serious opportunity to mess with your career in the future. And that's when I realized that the peer review process is anonymous for a reason. There are downsides to it, but the upsides really kind of offset the downsides. And generally speaking, reviewer comments do improve manuscripts. And one of the things that I think most people don't realize is that as you get better at writing papers, as you write better papers that where reviewers can find what they're looking for more easily, that they don't have to kind of jump around your paper looking for stuff that they really want to know, you start getting better reviews because reviewers are incentivized to provide better comments, more constructive comments on papers that are kind of structured in a way that is predictable and that are written in a way that is expected of reviewers. And so, you know, some people will say, well, that's gatekeeping. I kind of have a problem with that term because the term gatekeeping comes from hobby communities. Uh, and it's perfectly fine if you want to, if someone decides to mansplain to you what the rules of, I don't know, Dungeons and Dragons are and say, well, you're not really playing Dungeons and Dragons because you're not using that one rule. That's a hobby. That's perfectly fine. What we do in economics is not a hobby, right? In most cases, in the best case scenario, our research findings go on to inform public policy debates or business strategy. And so it's far from hobbyists. This is professional activity, and I think gatekeeping is necessary and beneficial in cases where we're looking at serious things rather than just hobbies. So where to submit? I try to kind of break it down into four different categories. You have economics journals, you have general economics journals, and field journals. All economics journals have smaller, much more specialized audiences than other kinds of journals. And as a result, because the writing is much more technical, you have lower impact factors. And the trade-off here is that, if you publish in those journals, that is really, really prized within economics and within your department, most likely. And it's essential in departments. Then there are broader interdisciplinary journals, stuff like World Development, um, or global environmental change. They have broader readership. Food policy is an example of that too, right? There are a lot of economists who read food policy, but you also have sociologists and you have political scientists and anthropologists. So broader readership, and therefore, because they're less technical in nature, have higher impact factors, and they are valued in policy schools and multidisciplinary settings. And then you have stuff like general science journals like Science, Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, Nature, and so on. And those journals have got the broadest audience, the highest citation numbers, very high impact factors. And they tend, in econ journals, we tend to value internal validity. We tend to value causal identification almost at the detriment of nearly everything else. But in general science journals, they care less about that, and what they care more about is external validity. Does your finding apply to a wide range of settings worldwide? Because if it's not, they're just not really interested. And so a good rule of thumb, I think, here is before you start writing, try to think about where you would like to submit your paper, because each audience requires a slightly rewritten paper or a slightly different paper. And I would encourage you never to submit to predatory journals. There's plenty of lists of predatory journals out there, but don't submit to those. Don't feed the beast. It kind of, maybe it makes you feel good to have that publication after paying a lot of money afterwards. But it doesn't really advance social science or science in general because those journals publish a lot of garbage along with some good work. So it might be natural to ask when is the paper ready? My rule of thumb is when you keep hearing the same comments when you talk to people about your paper, and those comments refer to things that you can't change and can only acknowledge, it's about time that you submit. So we're economists. Think about what is the marginal cost of sitting on this paper a little bit longer versus the marginal benefit. If all you hear are things that you've heard before, you can't change them, the cost of waiting, it exceeds those benefits. I would say, and this is something I've observed as editor, is everyone wants to submit around the same time. There are a lot of people who submit before the holidays or before the school year starts. So if you know that the school year in the Northern Hemisphere starts in August, September, if you submit at that time, things are going to be slower because you and 2,000 of your closest friends are submitting at the same time. and are competing for reviewer attention. It's kind of a marginal thing at the end, right? It's probably going to change your decision times by maybe up to a month, but it's good to know that, things tend to get busy at certain times, and there are these waves. This is not a uniformly distributed kind of submission rate throughout the year. I would encourage you to submit early before a major deadline. So if you're going to go on the job market in 3-4 years, now's the time to submit because you want to have a publication by then. If you want a paper in time for tenure, you should probably submit at least 3 years ahead of time because those things are slow. And the more you wait, or the more you can wait to polish, but the time to acceptance can be anywhere from 1 to 5 years. I mean, my longest paper, I think from inception, from the idea to publication, took about 10 years. I remember from June 2002 to sometime in 2012. So things can take a long time. Art is very long, and criticism is really easy. So one of the things too that I would encourage you to think about is, very few people have the luxury of doing just research. Or doing just their own research. If you have other responsibilities like admin, like chairing a department or teaching, I would say try to submit your research before you get to those other things, because if you say, well, I'll get to research after I'm done with those other things, Parkinson's law says that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. So submit your job market paper before teaching begins. Teaching can and will expand to fill every available hour, and you know this if you've ever taught a class. So if you get a revise and resubmit decision and you want to respond to referees, I would say treat every comment as an opportunity to improve the paper. Provide a detailed response letter, address every point, explain what you did and why, and if you disagree, explain it clearly. Don't just ignore it, and don't be snarky about it. Another rule of thumb is if you're going to disagree with reviewers, you can probably only do it once per paper. I wouldn't say for every other comment we respectfully disagree. Try to find creative ways to engage with reviewer comments. Editors will rely on your responses to see if you're acting in good faith and to determine whether reviewers are also acting in good faith. Now, top field journals typically require more than 2 rounds of revisions. Top general journals sometimes move faster, sometimes slower. They have a very high bar at submission, so you almost always get desk rejected at top general journals. And a rejection after a revise and resubmit is not uncommon, much more common at top general journals. First round acceptances are kind of like UFOs. Everyone's heard of them. Very few people have actually seen one. I mean, I have a colleague, Paul Glevy, who's been in this job for nearly 40 years, and I think he had one first round conditional acceptance once in career, which is exceedingly rare. How about giving talks? The way you give a talk is essentially structured the same way you would write a paper. But one of the things that I've noticed is that having an appendix is really underrated. So you can have an appendix to your talk just like you do to your paper, where you stick a bunch of stuff that you can have on hand if people ask you questions about those things. You don't need to have them in the main kind of part of the paper, but having an appendix that you can flip to really, really quickly to say, aha, I've thought about that. Here's an answer to your question. Everything that didn't fit in the main talk, extra robustness checks, proofs, experimental protocols, answers to common questions. What it does is that it signals that you're really well prepared, and it signals that you've really thought about those things and that your work has depth. It's not just kind of a one-off thing. Another thing that very few people seem to ignore, and it's kind of hard to do in a Zoom talk like this because there's none of that physical energy and back and forth, is that you're really there when you're invited for a seminar to talk with your audience and not at them. And especially, you should treat the question and answer period as a scientific conversation and not as a defense of your work, even if you've heard the same questions before. So I've heard people criticize speakers who already know what the question is going to be about because they've heard it 10 times before, and they start answering the question before the questioner is even done asking. That's kind of like a mark of there's very little respect to your audience if you start answering their questions before they're even done asking. There's different types of talk: invited seminar, which is 75 to 90 minutes, a conference presentation, which is 15 to 20, and then there's kind of policy talks that are a little bit looser or lay audiences. So 2 weeks ago, my daughter's school invites people to come and talk about their work, and so they have this career cafe thing in the morning every week, and I went in and talked about my work for about 20 minutes. And so that has to be much more general than an invited seminar. You just need to know what kind of audience you're looking for. And I give some general rules here and in the book. But a universal principle is that for all types of talks, except maybe an audience of elementary schoolers like I had 2 weeks ago, assume that your audience is really smart university graduates with no experience in your field. Emphasize your motivations and intuition, and define your technical concepts in plain language. Because that way, even if you go and talk to other people who are in your, discipline of economics or agricultural, or even your field, they may not know about the questions you're looking at because they've been working on something else. And so you will never lose kind of any credibility for over explaining things or making things a little bit too simple. Always take notes during your Q&As. Restate questions before answering them. If you don't know something, don't lie about it. Just admit it. And in economics, the seminar culture is blunt, but it's generally not adversarial. Most people ask questions because they're really interested in the answer, and not just because they want to show that they're smarter than you. Your Q&A behavior really is kind of your professional reputation getting defined in real time. Be charitable and generous towards people asking questions. Be intellectually honest, and that'll be remembered a lot longer. How you make people feel is remembered a lot longer than what you tell them in the technical pyrotechnics. I am running out of time. I have about a minute left. I'm going to skip talking about funding, and I can get back to that if people have any questions. But I just want to talk about communicating for impact. So if you want to have research impact, publishing in peer-reviewed journals is not it. It may be your end goal in order to get promoted or get tenure. But it's not the end of the road for a paper if you want to have impact, right? It's kind of the first step is getting it out there, getting it published, credentialed by a journal. Policymakers, practitioners, and the public don't read the Journal of Development Economics. They are more likely to read interdisciplinary journals like World Development and Food Policy. They're even more likely to read stuff like Nature, Science, and PNAS because those articles are written for general audiences. But what people are likely to look at are policy briefs, blog posts, short videos explainers that talk about your work. So many funders now explicitly require that kind of stuff in addition to kind of the core papers that you're going to generate with their money. The hidden curriculum includes knowing how to translate rigorous findings into accessible language for a lay audience. This has been made considerably easier by generative AI. So one of the things that I did, and if you go to my website, you'll see it in a blog post. I think it's probably the first one now, titled The Geopolitics of Food and Agriculture. It's a new paper that I have with Bernhard Dahlheimer. Both Bernhard and I went on Notebook LM independently and asked it to make, my apologies, asked it to make kind of a short video just synthesizing for a general audience what's in the paper. And that takes about 20 minutes. You can't do too many a week because Google poses a limit on that, but it's easily done. You can also generate kind of a podcast about your work that sounds like the real thing. So if you're going to make public claims, however, it can carry legal and reputational weight. So one of the things that I was keenly aware of, I published an op-ed in the New York Times about 10 years ago, titled "Farmers Markets and Foodborne Illness." And one of the things that was kind of on top of my mind was the fact that there's a very, very famous TV host, Oprah Winfrey, who had been sued by the Texas Beef Group because she had directly linked the consumption of beef with mad cow disease on her TV show, got sued for $1 billion. And so you have to be kind of careful about the things you're saying. They need to be kind of, first off, you really want to avoid getting sued by anyone. So don't say things that are false. If you're going to say something, make sure that it's true and well documented. So be clear, don't be sloppy, and verify your claims before you speak to the media. All kinds of outreach, policy briefs, op-eds in newspapers. I mentioned the one that I had in the New York Times, blog posts and social media. So whenever I finish a new paper, I'll go talk about it in a blog post or on LinkedIn. And then eventually reporters will find their way to you and will ask you to be, if they can talk to you for an article they're writing, to be on their radio show, to be on TV, and so on. The thing is, if you enjoy doing media and want to be asked again, be clear, don't be sloppy, and master the art of the soundbite. So before you go in, know what you want to say, and especially if you're going to be on the radio or on television or in the newspaper, they really kind of like to have kind of a pithy statement of what you want to tell them that can kind of hold in 1 or 2 sentences, what's called a soundbite. And when I get asked to do media, when I get asked by a reporter, hey, can we talk? I typically ask them, what's your deadline? Because those people are on deadlines that are a lot shorter than ours. And then I spend some time preparing for what they want to talk about, even if I'm an expert on the topic, because I want to have kind of clear facts, updated of updated numbers and so on. And I want to think about what the soundbite is going to be. Let me just stop here because I have a lot more stuff, and I will take your questions because I've already been going on for more than my time.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think we can get through all of this within 30 minutes. You agree with me that 30 minutes is quite short for us to get through all you have for us. What I picked from what you've mentioned, you went through writing and how to write good papers, how to navigate the peer review process, how to give a talk, and other ways to disseminate our research. I think some people already dropped some questions in the chat box, so I'll read out some of the questions. But if you want to ask any question directly, just raise your hand, I'll call you out. Then you can unmute and speak. So we have a question. Please, what is your view on the perception in some quarters that the quality of an article should matter more than the publication outlet, even if it is predatory? So
I entirely disagree with that. Because people are going to be using people are going to look at your CV. You know, if you say, I can publish a high quality article in a predatory journal, yeah, you can actually, you know, like those predatory journals will take your money and they'll publish just about anything. The thing is, people I told you already, people won't read stuff. People will read the title, the abstract, maybe the intro. And so they'll never get to know that your work is good. Because, you know, first off, it'll be published in a journal that few people read, and they probably won't read it. And the way people look at CVs, the way people look at, you know, websites is they look at where you've published work, and then they decide on the basis of that, what is the quality of your research agenda? And so those where you publish is used as a proxy for research quality. And so I apologize, but I fundamentally disagree with I can publish great work in predatory journals and I'll still be okay.
Right. Another question is, does impact factor determine the standard of the journal?
Absolutely not. No. I mean, I don't want to name names, but there are journals that have very high impact factors that routinely publish what I would uncharitably call garbage work. It's not very nice to call it that, but you know, those journals have very high impact factors. They're just not very selective. They select on something else. I don't know, but they have high impact factors and the work is not great.
Okay, so we have Abdullah Abdul Karim. Please go ahead, speak, ask your question.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. My question is to the speaker. Please, how can an early career researcher in Nigeria access funding, like funding opportunities for their research projects, and how can the key elements of successful funding proposal, like what are the key elements of a successful funding proposal? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you, Abdullahi. That's a good question. It's too bad I didn't get a chance to get to the funding aspects. It'll be in the slides, but in short, so how can you get, I have to be very honest, I don't know what the sources of funding available to you in Nigeria are. I would assume that there are some governmental sources, there's some university level, smaller pots of money. There might be some bigger things that you can get at the international level. What makes a research proposal successful is first off, is it realistic? Can you do the work that you have to understand what the donor wants? You have to know what they have funded in the past in order to know what kind of work. And if they say we're interested in this, and that, you have to answer all those criteria. You can't just go in, oh, I would like to work on that. Maybe this call for papers is the right thing. It's very rare that, you know, a donor will come out with a call for papers that corresponds exactly to the work you've been doing. So typically it's kind of give or take, right? You have to give them what they want. Maybe you can kind of squeeze in something that you're interested in on the back end of a proposal that you're writing for donors. But what makes a proposal successful, same thing as a paper, clarity in writing, being concise, so not wasting your reader's time. It's useful to understand who's going to read your proposal. So if your proposal is read by, say, a group of social scientists who are not necessarily economists, they are going to be first off, not only are they not going to be impressed by technique, they're going to be irritated by it because they typically don't have the level of technique that economists have. So you have to explain things in plain English. If you're writing for an audience, for your reviewers or economists, that's a very different type of writing. But typically grant panels are often called from different disciplines. So you have to write, again, for smart, college-educated readers without throwing too much technique at them. You have to give the donor what they want, so you have to answer their criteria. It often really, really helps if you have done some preliminary work and you can point to the fact that, hey, I've already started on this. These are some preliminary findings I have. If I get funding, I'll be able to do the kind of the big project and answer those bigger questions. And then another thing, and this is so underestimated, but when you write a budget, don't just guess the numbers. Don't give estimates. You can go online and look at how much a plane ticket's going to cost you from that date to that date, from that airport to that other airport. You can go online and price out what a hotel stay is going to be. You don't have to say, oh, well, I think it's going to be about $200 per night. You can find that information easily. And the more precise you are in writing and in your budget numbers, the more you signal credibility, the more you signal that you've thought about that you're serious about doing that work, that you didn't just kind of say, oh, I'm going to apply just in case. And you're not going off of vibes. You're serious about this. So
Great.
Abdullahi, I will share my slides and you'll see that there's more details in there.
Thank you so much. I think the last question, because I think Mark needs to go to class. There's a question around publishing in journals not indexed in Scopus, or worse, if they are considered predatory. Journals not indexed in Scopus, are they considered predatory?
That's probably a good question. I have no idea what the answer is. I pay little to no attention to Scopus or what is WS's World of Science, I think. I don't know what the answer to that question is. I think it helps to publish in journals that are indexed. There are some countries where you have to publish in indexed journals for them to count for like government funding bodies and so on. I think in South Korea, you absolutely have to publish in indexed journals. Otherwise, they're just not going to get counted for promotion. So it's probably a good rule of thumb to publish in those journals. Since this was quick, I can maybe answer the other one. Khadija,
yes, please.
As an undergrad with little or no research experience, how can we effectively navigate the research world from getting started to learning, growing? As an undergraduate with little or no research experience, I would say your best bet is to go to graduate school in order to learn how to do this. This is not something you can just pick up by doing it yourself. You need to have proper guidance of academic advisors and so on.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Before you go, I think we should take a group picture. If we can all turn on our videos so that we can take a group picture with Mark in it.
Also, Khadija, I'd like to say that my email is open. So if people have questions, you can email me and I will send you my slides after we're done.
Yes, please. Thank you so much. Please, let's turn on our videos. Innocent, are you there? I'm trying to change the view gallery. Yes, great faces. Yeah. So let me quickly take one. See, we have guests from different parts of the world, not just from the University of Ilorin. Oh, the Vice Chancellor is also a moment sad. Let me just grab another picture. The Vice Chancellor in it. Mr. Mubarak, thank you for showing your face. Another page. We have some of our past students that are now in the US also on the call. Give me, I want to take everyone to cover everybody. Leave the last pages. Okay. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.
Call on you another time. Probably you'll get to visit the university at some point.
I would really like that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. So let's move on. Our next speakers, we have Maya and Jenna. They'll be presenting together. They're both from the Center for Effective Global Action, CEGA, at the University of California, Berkeley. Maya is the Director of Policy and Inclusion, while Jenna is the Program Manager at SEGA, where she manages initiatives like the Gates-funded Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative. It's important to note that the SEGA program runs a fellowship targeting early career African social scientists. And I'm pleased to mention that 3 members of our department actually have won the fellowship. We have 2 PhD students that have benefited from the CAGA fellowship. And we also have a faculty member who is currently a fellow with SEGA. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce the SEGA team to speak with us today on funding, research, communication, and everything in between. So if you have more questions on funding, I think these are the people to ask your questions. Over to you, Jenna and Maya.
Thank you, Professor Khadijat. That's such a warm and kind introduction. It's really quite an honor to speak to the University of Ilorin's agricultural group today. As the professor mentioned, my name is Jenna. I'm the agricultural manager at SEGA. I've been with SEGA for about 5 years. I'll turn it over to Maya to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, everyone. Nice to see you all. Thank you, Professor Khadija, and thank you to the Vice Chancellor also for being here and for his introduction, and pleasure speaking with you all. I'm Maya Ranganath. I've been with SEGA for the past 10 years. I'm our Director of Policy and Inclusion, and so I work on how our research ultimately influences policy decision-making, and also on inclusion, which means how do we connect with scholars such as yourself, really make sure you're at the forefront of leading development economics research. So I'll be happy to talk to you later today a little bit about the fellowship that Professor Khadija mentioned, and as well as many other aspects of training and accessing opportunities. So pass it to, go ahead, Jenna.
Sure. This is our agenda today. We'll do a quick intro to our organization and then talk about acquiring funding through grants. We'll talk a little bit about the SEGA Fellowship and other training opportunities, and then communicating and disseminating evidence. So a little bit about SEGA, or the Center for Effective Global Action. We are a hub for research and training and innovation, and we're based at the University of California in Berkeley. The SEGA is dedicated to understanding the drivers of poverty. Our history begins in the early 2000s with leadership from Edward Miguel, who's our co-founder and faculty co-director. And since the early 2000s, SEGA has grown to a community of research across the world. We are mostly focused on causal inference, but import ideas and methods from other disciplines like psychology and sociology, and also data science, to help understand and solve complex economic challenges. And you might know the Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa, or NERA. They were established in 2018 by alumni of the Global Networks Fellowship that's run by SEGA. And it's now a Pan-African-based organization dedicated to advancing impact evaluation for development policy making. And just to mention before we start on proposal writing, Maya and myself definitely do not profess ourselves as experts of these topics, but SEGA is a re-granting organization. So I think both of us have sat on many of proposal selection and fellowship selection committees. So we are solely sharing our personal experience with you all, and hope that you can also share some of your experience in the chat and some of your guidance and recommendations to your peers. Okay, so to start, identifying and scoping opportunities. Where can you find grant opportunities?
I can jump in here a little. So Mark alluded to this, and he had a very nice slide, which I wish we saw, but we'll see it after, of where to access kind of social science funding, other types of funding. I just wanted to give a list of like where generally, like what types of listservs to sign up for, that will send you opportunities. So luckily, there's a lot more opportunities that have become available to African scholars, to local researchers in the past 5 or so years. So, for example, the French Fund for Innovation and Development, they fund specifically a lot of early career researchers, a lot of LMIC scholars, and so definitely pay attention to that, to the International Growth Center, IPA, JPAL listservs, and of course, SIGA, we fund a lot of researchers also. So just pay attention to these listservs. We're going to send the links all over to you after so that you can know what to sign up for. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the fellowship later when we talk about training, but there's some opportunities. There's an opportunity we wanted to just mention that's available right now for scholars. That's the African Scholars Program at JPAL, and also there's a call right now for evaluating AI interventions used in health. So we'll send you the link to that as well, but look for there's going to be a lot of proposals coming up on how do we actually know AI interventions for international development are working. And so predict that this is going to be coming down the pipeline more and more, and happy to share more about other funding outlets in the Q&A.
Great. Okay, so next we're going to talk about vetting a grant opportunity. How do you assess the cost and benefit of applying to an RFP? So before starting to work on a proposal, what we do at SIGA is we conduct an intake on that proposal. And these are the different factors that we consider before we apply to a proposal opportunity. So first, checking the eligibility requirements. That's perhaps the most important. Because if SIGA isn't eligible, then we'll start the intake right there. Is it well suited to your area of work? Does the funder have a track record of funding similar proposals or peer organizations? Most organizations now do a really great job of including the grants that they've made on their website. And so that's something that you can always look up. If they're a US-based organization, usually you can access their tax forms online to see who they have funded in the past. Also consider the marginal benefit and the marginal cost. Is this proposal worth your time? And after reading an RFP, we like to draft an executive summary of the opportunity. And this is really helpful when trying to find partners and others to sign on to the program. Then we have something handy to send to those people. Also keep in mind that opportunities tend to be released annually and they tend to run on cycles. So if you aren't ready for a specific opportunity but would be in the future, don't be afraid to email the funders to ask about when the next call for funding will occur. Okay, now we will talk about writing a competitive grant proposal. What are the elements of a competitive proposal? There are a lot of great proposal writing guides online, including from our co-presenter, Mark. I'll link a couple in the chat here that I personally like. And this framework here is coming from Maya and my background, which is research competitions for impact evaluation research. So it's very important to make clear your research question, how it contributes to the broader literature, your strong scientific design, which is based on a theory of change, strong potential for policy impact, and the feasibility and logistics of your proposal should read sound. I loved the tip that Mark shared at the very end, making sure to be very detailed and clear about the budget, because it signals that the proposal, you're thinking very seriously about the logistics of the proposal to make it happen. And then finally, there's something that we call the art of grantsmanship. And this is the part about persuasively communicating why your specific research is a good fit for the funder. We want to share that we think this is very important, but it's not a substitute for a strong proposal idea. A good proposal ultimately brings together strong grantsmanship and also a strong proposal idea. Nevertheless, it's really important to be strategic about how you communicate your idea based on who the funder is. Know your audience. Sometimes funders will provide an evaluation or scoring criteria with the RFP. So I like to have that up on my screen while I'm writing, so I can check back and understand how the funder is going to be assessing the proposal that I'm writing. If you have access to a proposal from someone who has been awarded in the past, even better. Definitely use your contacts to see if you can access a winning proposal from the past. Finally, Maya and I and SIGA at large have been talking about the use of AI when proposal writing. My personal opinion is that it can be really helpful to refine language, but it doesn't perform as well with original ideation. So we caution on over relying on AI. Personally, I like to get the first draft out from my own brain down on paper and then work with AI to help with grammar, spelling, punctuation, that kind of thing. Okay, so drawing your attention to the Venn diagram here, this is where we think there's a winning combination. It's when funders have an interest, your research fits that interest, and the policy needs align. And I also really liked this quote to emphasize the combination I was speaking about on the last slide of having a strong research idea plus good grantsmanship. The art of grantsmanship will not turn mediocre science into a fundable grant proposal, but poor grantsmanship will and often does turn very good science into an unfundable grant proposal. Okay, and then lastly, this is just a simple checklist for when you're finishing a proposal. Make sure that you have met all the requirements and that all of your documents are submitted in the way that the funder is requiring. Archive your documents. Make sure to follow up with all of the stakeholders that you're working with, potentially sharing that full package proposal. If your proposal is unsuccessful, don't be afraid to ask for feedback. As I mentioned, these funding opportunities tend to run on cycles, so it's always great to get feedback for the next time and consider whether you could adapt your materials for another opportunity.
Thanks, Jenna. I'll share a couple of tips for if you're just starting out, you maybe don't have a lot of research funding yet, but you're interested. I just compiled a couple of tips for, early career scholars. So first of all, there's a lot of, $50K, $100,000 grants available, but there's also a lot of $5,000, $10,000 grants available. And so starting a little bit smaller can be useful as a stepping stone to access the bigger grants. Definitely from my experience, building collaborations with mentors, accessing research networks can really help. And also, it's really helped a lot of our fellows to co-author initially with more senior researchers. So really finding opportunities and seeking out collaborations, going to conferences can help to build those relationships. Exactly what Jenna just said, really learn from your unsuccessful proposals, ask for feedback. That can really help you when you're earlier on. Develop a long-term research agenda. So that's like have a vision for like what types of research you want to work on, where you eventually want to go towards, and like use these proposals to fulfill that vision. And then leading into our next topic is to really seek out training opportunities, seek out fellowship opportunities. There's a lot of virtual options available, and these can help you give you a leg up in your career. So let me, Jenna, if you can go to the next slide. So training and fellowship. So other than grants, what kinds of opportunities should you look out for? Go next. So I want to share a resource that SIGA put together. So we started this program called the Collaboration for Inclusive Development Research that did a study on what opportunities are available for scholars, and also went a little bit deeper on like what are the current barriers, what are the opportunities for African scholars in development research. And so we have a publication on that that's coming out pretty soon. But one product of that we created is the Cedar Opportunity Hub. And so you can see this is just a screenshot, but it's much more vast than this. We have put together a lot of fellowship opportunities, a lot of funding opportunities, training opportunities from us and from our partner organizations. And so this gets updated quite regularly. And so it's a really good starting point. You can search by what country you're looking for, whether it's a fellowship or a shorter training. So definitely check this out and use it to find training and opportunities. And also all the listservs that I mentioned earlier will also alert you to these types of opportunities. So I want to tell you a little bit about the SIGA Fellowship since I know you're probably interested. And Khadija, you mentioned this earlier, and so glad we have a couple of fellows here with us as well, and definitely want to deepen our partnership with the University of Ilorin in this way. So we have two different models that I should mention. So one is a 4-month residential model at UC Berkeley, and one is a non-resident, more like a 10-week model. And like we know that visas are getting very difficult for a lot of countries, unfortunately. And so this non-resident model is a really good option, even if you can't come here, fortunately. So we have our next call will be later this year or in January. And so the distinguishing factors of the SIGA Fellowship is that you get assigned a mentor and you're working on your own research idea. So it's a really good stepping stone to eventually getting research funding because you're getting feedback over the course of the semester from many different people, many leading scholars in the field. We focus on quantitative social sciences, and so you get to, in the non-resident model, take an online course, and in the residential model, you can audit a few classes at Berkeley. And you're really integrated into these research environments, and so it can be really helpful to do this fellowship and get to experience those kinds of deep connections. So if there's any questions about the fellowship, I'm more than happy to answer. But also, I think I saw Sunmi Bola on the call. We have others on the call, and they're great resources for you as well. There's a couple other trainings that you should look out for. There's one specifically focused on agriculture at Cornell. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's also been very helpful for people in our networks to do that fellowship. There's a MicroMasters program that JPAL offers. The Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa offers a lot of trainings. And I should say that everybody who does the SIGA Fellowship becomes a member of this network. And so there's definitely members who are based in Nigeria. And so look out for their trainings. And then there's a whole range of online courses that can really help you supplement your university education. A few tips from evaluating the fellowship applications, evaluating just different training proposals. It's quite similar actually to the tips for applying to a proposal, for submitting a publication, these kinds of things, but it's just always start with carefully reading the eligibility requirements before you start. Ask questions if you're unsure. There'll usually be a contact listed. Talk to others who've completed the program. So talk to other people at your university who've maybe done the fellowship or done different trainings. Have a very clear why. So why should it be you? Why is this a good time for you now? Why this particular fellowship? I can't tell you how many applications I read for the fellowship that are kind of just generic, like it could be sent to any different fellowship, but doesn't really say, why do you want to do the opportunity that we are offering? So be sure to be specific, write clearly, but again, as others have said, be very careful with AI. It's just now when I'm evaluating proposals and I can see it's written by AI fully, it's already sort of a filter of like, okay, did this person actually write this? So use it, but use it wisely. And then, yeah, just for us, especially, and for other training programs, we think we like to invest in individuals, but hope they'll make a broader impact. So talk about how it'll help you, but also talk about how this could help other people, other students. It could help policymakers, how you're really going to pass on what you learned to your institution. So that's really helpful, when we read applications to see all of that. Go ahead. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about communicating evidence. There's going to be some overlap with Mark's presentation, but hopefully it'll just help reinforce some of the ideas and come from a different perspective. Go next. Here's something we borrowed from the Center for Global Development of I'm not going to go too deep into this, but you'll see it in the slide of kind of how demand for evidence can eventually makes its way into being used by policymakers, and there's many steps of the process, and they're all kind of iterative. So you can go to the next slide, but you can refer to this later on. So I want to tell you a little bit of I did a very cursory sort of literature review on what are the enabling factors for evidence use in policy? So there's more and more studies that have been coming out that are really looking kind of in a meta lens, like how does research make its way into decision making? What are the enabling factors? So a broad summary of like what I've learned, and again, take it with a grain of salt because it was like quite broad and quite brief of an exercise, but data systems and availability of that can really be enabling factors for policy. Sometimes external pressure on policymakers to report development progress leads to different policy outcomes and policymakers being more receptive to evidence. Definitely technical capacity within government, evidence champions within government can really help researchers be able to communicate. One study that was interesting that came out in the last year or two is that it's policymakers are much more likely to adopt changes if it's like they already have a program going and you're just layering on a slight change to the program rather than introducing a new program. This is obvious, but they did a big study on this and found very strong results that it's much more likely they're going to use incremental changes. Policy windows is a big deal. So know your policy windows, like when is a decision going to be made? When is a government changing and maybe they'll be receptive to evidence? The timing really matters. Relationships and co-creation with policymakers really matters. Talk about this too. And just really like institutionalizing evidence. So not only like communicating the results of your study, but also helping, be a partner for governments, for NGOs, and how they actually use evidence to make decisions on an institutional level supports them being used later. Go next.
Okay.
And Jenna, yeah.
I'm going to get more into the details on communicating evidence. So often, as Maya mentioned, it's thought as the last step of the research project cycle, but intentions around communications can start before the study even begins. So these are some of the practical details we think of before beginning a project. Make sure to check budget allowability for these items. Some funders are more friendly to funding dissemination than others. I think we've seen a positive shift in the direction of funding dissemination, which is great. But if those items are allowed, then we really encourage including them upfront in your budget. Make sure to know who your audience is and try to see at the beginning of your research project if you can incorporate questions that they are curious about. What are their incentives to engaging with you? Inform these decisions with the information you have about their power structures. It's important to identify champions, especially within the government, and specifically champions that have decision-making power. But sometimes these policy champions can also be at intermediary or advocacy organizations like think tanks and research centers. And when it comes time to communicate your research results, these are some considerations that you can think about. Use the right medium. I think you're the best judge of this, but if in doubt, you can experiment with the different kinds of mediums that you use to communicate your findings. Speak the language of the person you're trying to reach and know why they're engaging with you and what their incentives might be. And when introducing your findings, convey your findings accurately and clearly. Keep your caveats when needed for accuracy. We know that heterogeneity is super important in economics research, but be mindful about how these details and caveats are presented. Are they creating confusion or are they adding some interesting complexity that the decision maker cares about?
This is a nice, I'm talking about this, right? Yeah. This is a nice kind of diagram that goes, Mark mentioned that, you have to communicate different levels for different people. So this is what we call the pyramid principle. So it shows like, so example, you take social media, like it's very short the way you'd communicate, but it reaches a huge audience. And then the inverse is true at the bottom. We see publications, reports, journal articles. It's much more in depth and much more long, but it reaches a very small audience. So you really have to think about like what is your finding, who do you want to communicate with, and like what type of communication method you should use, like because not everything, it's not one size fits all. So you really have to tailor it to who you're working with. And I just wanted to mention, you know, we've been talking about governments, but there's so many different types of policy actors and so many people that could really use evidence that you produce. So that's everybody from an NGO to like, you know, just a lot of there's a lot of different, users of evidence, different levels of government, nonprofits could all be beneficiaries of what you produce. So can go next. Just again from evaluating how researchers have in our networks have worked. So like there's some things that many researchers get wrong. So one is leading with my methods instead of the insights. So when you're talking to an NGO or a government partner and you say, you know, like I've done this rigorous methodology, they might just you might get lost. And so as academics, we really care about that, but you just have to be careful with how you communicate that with policymakers. Often researchers share results too late. So after decisions have already been made. So make sure you're timely, again, overloading with data and like using one size fits all outputs. And then sometimes researchers don't have a clear ask, like a so what. So we've done all this research, it shows us this, and that's it. Or like, what do you want them to do based on this? So just make sure you have that as well. And yeah, so just a summary of everything Jenna and I have talked about. So there's places where you can look to find opportunities. There's listservs, the Co-Hub, LinkedIn is a great resource. We'll share this. Look for mentorships, networks, practical research skill building, like the SIGA Fellowship, like other fellowships and training opportunities available. For grants, choose your grants wisely, search widely for these grants. There's many more that are available to you now, and also, again, just stay on top of organizations that you know give out grants and see if they have opportunities. You can really make yourself stand out by having like a clear research interest, a clear policy interest, really differentiating why now, why this opportunity. And this is just a couple steps you can take after this webinar. Sign up for the listservs, look at the Co-Hub, and like start to think about like how you'll sharpen your writing and your data skills, because that really affects everything else. And with that, we'll close. So thank you so much, and we're open to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jenna and Maya. I think we have a question in the chat box. But what I picked from your presentation, you mentioned a list of opportunities for us to assess. You also mentioned the importance of having mentors or being in a research network, and also how to better communicate research evidence. So we have a question from for Luke or Latoye. The question is it okay to ask that you share some winning proposal? Are you willing to share some winning proposal to serve as a guide for people to draft their proposal?
Yeah, definitely. In our SIGA Fellowship call, we have an example of like a research proposal that's a winning proposal, but it's a nice question that I can ask some of our fellows if they might be willing to share their full application package so people can use it as an example. So happy to look into that.
Okay.
And in terms of research proposals,
yeah,
I know that JPAL has a guide, which I'll put in the chat, that has some successful proposals to a few of their initiatives.
Yeah. Great. We have hand up, Abdulkarim Moloide Prop. Unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for this wonderful presentation. And thank you for putting this together. And I think this is a very wonderful initiative. And first of all, I think from the Research Office of University of Ilorin, I hope that we'll be able to have a proper collaboration going forward, because I think this is something that is useful, and I'm sure a lot of us had found it very useful today. So going to my question, it has to do with in terms of founders' interest and also at times the interest of the host institution. Because a lot of times what we see is that institutions have long-term goals, and you'll find out that founders, what they are all about, a lot of times is about short-term goals because yes, they need to have deliverables within a period of time. So how do you balance this? Because it's a challenge because sometimes when you are writing some of these proposals, you have to have a balance because you want to get these grants, but at the same time, you don't want to get a grant that at the end of the day would be totally out of principle for you. So
Yeah.
how do you balance this when you are putting these proposals together? Thank you.
Jenna?
Yeah, before you respond, let me just introduce him. Professor Oloyede is the director of the Center for Research, Development, and In-house Training at the university.
Amazing.
So thank you for joining us, Prof.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, and it's so wonderful to be here. I wish that this could be a bit more of a dialogue, but that's sometimes hard over Zoom. In terms of your question, I completely agree with you that this is a tension we encounter as well. I think one way we tackle it is by being very detailed and specific about the timeline. Most proposals I've responded to require some kind of timeline. And so I try to do a really rigorous job building that out. That way I can keep myself honest to the kinds of deliverables that we're promising to the funder in the proposal. I think you can get yourself into a tricky situation when you overpromise and then are funded for something that is not realistic on the timeline that you've given. So really detailed project planning at the start, I think can help a bit with this tension. I don't know, do you have more to share, Maya, with your experience?
No, I mean, it's something we all struggle with, and SIGA struggles with too, just to be frank. And also I would love to speak with you and others further about how to develop, partnerships between our institutions too. So let's definitely follow up about that point. I think one thing that can help that we do sometimes is like, if we want to apply to something, it's not exactly within our scope, but we can offer something, a small piece of it. We often apply to proposals with other partners. So it's like, okay, we'll go on in this together and you do this and we'll do this. And that can alleviate maybe some of the scope creep of like, okay, we're bending over backwards to fit this one funding opportunity. It's like, oh, actually, we have this small thing to contribute and we can work in a consortium with other universities, other institutions. So that's just one way we've tried this. And then also like for us, it's really been like developing those relationships with program officers, with funders who know us, who know what we're good at, and they trust us over a longer course rather than just, applying to something that's like a bit smaller. So we haven't figured it out, but I'm always happy to talk more.
I don't know if we have any more questions. Hands up. Questions, we are open to more questions from Maya and Jenna, and we will definitely follow up on the prospect of collaborating between the two universities, right?
Someone asked use of AI in proposal writing in the chat. I think we covered that, but just to reiterate, use it to edit your draft, but not to do the first draft. I know that's really hard because there's an impulse to say, like, I don't know where to begin, just ask AI to write it. But the funder can tell, right? So we can tell if something is not your idea. So make it your idea and then use it to, I like that it's leveling the playing field for writing skills and for English skills. And so use it to edit your grammar, to edit your punctuation, but be careful with using it for a first draft, is what I would say.
Yeah. Any other question, please? I think we are out of time. We're already 5 minutes ahead. Any other questions? If there are no questions, then I would like to call on the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture, Professor Israel Ogunlade, to please give us his closing remark. Dean, sir.
Thank you, the head of department, Agri-Economics and Farm Management. You have invited experienced people to handle this webinar. And there is no doubt that all the participants have benefited from their wealth of experience. In fact, for you to draw the Vice Chancellor and the Director of credit to this webinar is a plus, because the Vice Chancellor mentioned that what we have done today, we can also make it available for other faculties and departments to benefit. So I want to show appreciation to Mark Bellimer, Jennifer, and Maya for their brilliant presentations and for the way they have answered our questions. I know that very soon they will hear from us what we are using the knowledge gained today to achieve. The impact they have made is an indelible one, which later on will bring commendation to the organizations. So I thank you for this unique opportunity you have given us. And I thank the speakers for sharing with us their wealth of experience. And for all the participants also, we are very grateful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. The Vice Chancellor, Professor Wahab Olashupo Egbewale, Director of ComSit, the Dean of the Faculty, Professor Israel Ogunlade, other senior members of staff at the Faculty of Agriculture, including Professor Olubumi Abayomi Omotesho, the speakers, Mark in absentia, Jenna, Maya, thank you so much for agreeing to join us and share your experience with us. We'll reach out again. We'll keep asking for more, definitely. I'll reach out again and I will keep in touch. Thank you, everyone, for joining, the graduate students, all other students, other participants, ladies and gentlemen. See you next time.
Thank you all so much for the invitation. Really nice to see you all today.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.